The building was supposed to be empty. I had stayed past 7 for a retake, 3 words that kept landing wrong, and I never leave wrong on tape. The corridor outside Studio 4 was dark. Marette's private room at the end of the hall was supposed to be locked. It was not locked. From behind the glass, I heard something that stopped every thought. I heard my own voice. Not today's voice. Not the one I bring to the booth each morning. The voice from 4 years ago, the one that only lived when no one was listening, the one I had not heard since the recording I no longer remember making, the one I did not know anyone kept. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. Thread and Tone occupied the 4th floor of a narrow building on West 29th Street. In a block, the city had half preserved and half forgotten, the way cities forget things they once understood completely. The walls in the stairwell had the particular resonant hum of acoustic tile and old wood, the kind of place where silence had been manufactured for several generations, and the building had absorbed the habit. The studio smelled of rosin and warm circuitry, and, underneath everything, a faint cedar scent that came from the acoustic panels in the main recording rooms, which Marette had sourced herself from a supplier she never discussed. I had been a session vocalist and narrative voice artist at Thread and Tone for 2 years. Long enough to know the behavior of every monitor in every room. Long enough to understand the way Studio 2 went slightly wide in the low mids on damp days, and the particular sound the third board chair made at the end of a long session when someone finally stopped holding themselves still. Long enough to know when the building was empty and when it was merely quiet, which were different things. It was empty. Or it should have been. Marette had a client meeting at 7. Penn had a mix session at another studio across town. The maintenance team came on Fridays. The building after 7 on a Thursday was my preferred version of it, the particular silence of a space designed for sound once all the people have left it. I had stayed to fix a retake. 3 words in the final passage of a narration block for a long-form documentary series. They kept landing wrong, not technically. Technically they were clean, but wrong in the way that only I could identify, where the emotional placement was 1 degree off from where the line needed to be. I do not leave wrong on tape. This is the most fundamental thing about me professionally and, as it turns out, in other respects as well. The corridor outside Studio 4 was dark. Marette's private studio, the room at the far end of the hall behind the door I had never once seen open, was supposed to be locked. It was not locked. The door sat 3 inches open, not wide, enough for sound to escape. And the sound was my voice. I stood in the corridor with my headphone cable coiled in my hand and understood, in the seconds before my thinking caught up, that I was hearing myself. Not the professional version. Not the voice I bring to the booth each morning, the one I have trained and shaped and protected across a decade of work, the one that delivers narrative with warmth and precision, and only as much feeling as the piece requires. The other voice. The one that existed before the training. The one I had made one night in my apartment 4 years ago, in the first year of my marriage, when Dale was traveling for work and I was alone, in a way I did not yet have the right word for, and I had set up a borrowed condenser microphone and read something I had written because not reading it aloud felt like holding my breath indefinitely. I had sent that recording to production companies, general audition material, artistic sample, range demonstration. I had not said out loud what it actually was, which was a private record of what it felt like to stand at the edge of something you cannot name and be completely honest about it for the first time in longer than you can remember. I had not heard it since. I stood in the corridor and listened to my own voice reading words I had written at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday 4 years ago. I listened until the passage ended. Then I listened to the silence that came after, which was the silence of someone who has been inside a piece enough times to know exactly where it ends and does not need to reach for the controls to find it. Then I walked back to Studio 4, turned off the monitor, collected my things, and left by the stairs so that if anyone was anywhere in the building, they would not hear the door. I did not sleep. Marette Sane had built Thread and Tone over 12 years from a 2-room demo studio in Greenpoint into the most considered audio production house on the East Coast for high-concept narrative work. She had done this without investors, through a combination of sound judgment that the industry called instinct, and that anyone who had watched her work understood was something more structural, a precision of decision-making that operated at every level of a project simultaneously, from the physical acoustics of a space to the final mastering choices that determined whether a piece breathed or merely played. She was 37 years old. Before Thread and Tone, she had been a sound artist, abstract audio pieces that had exhibited in Oslo and Rotterdam and one gallery in Kyoto, all of which she had stopped producing entirely when the studio required her full attention. She did not discuss this. She did not discuss most things about herself. She discussed the work. In her understanding, the work was always the appropriate subject. She was contained in the way of someone who has been responsible for a great many moving pieces for a long time, and learned early that the most dangerous thing available to them is letting their internal weather affect the quality of their piece. Decisions. Dark hair she kept pinned during studio hours. She wore charcoal and deep slate and, in the fall, a burgundy so precise it looked designed. She moved through rooms with the economy of someone whose attention was always partially elsewhere, already at the next decision, the correction that needed to land before the session broke, the note she needed to give before the engineer left. She gave direction in complete, unhurried sentences. She never used excess language. She was not warm in the way that invited informality. She was something more specific than that. She paid attention in a way that made you feel, in the room she was directing you in, like you were the most interesting problem currently worth solving, which was either professional excellence or something else. I had spent my first year at Thread and Tone deciding it was professional excellence. In the second year, I had been less certain. The moment I first registered the distinction was not dramatic. It happened during my 7th month at Thread and Tone, in a late October afternoon, when the session had narrowed to me and the engineer and Marette in the control room, reviewing the week's recorded work. I had been working through a narration passage for a medical history series, a woman describing her mother's illness in retrospect, the specific quality of grief that comes from loss you spent years anticipating, and that still arrives without warning. Emotionally demanding material. I had been having difficulty with it for 3 sessions, landing the information correctly, but not the feeling underneath the information, which is a different problem and a harder one. She stopped the playback at the same sentence twice. Both times she said nothing immediately. The third time through, she came into the booth. She crossed the room and adjusted the script stand by 2 inches. She said, "You are reading toward the end of that sentence, rather than sitting inside the beginning of it. The weight is at the start, not the finish." I ran it again. She was right. The line opened differently. She stood in the booth for a few seconds after the take, not leaving immediately. It was such a small delay. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. She had done it before. I realized then, and I had not registered it as anything except the natural pause of someone completing a professional task before returning to the board. Standing at the microphone in October, I registered it. She said, "That's the one," and went back to the control room. I stood at the microphone and understood, without being ready to examine the understanding, that the way she had crossed the booth to adjust the stand was not the movement of someone completing a task. The adjustment was real. The task was real. But the crossing was the point. She had found a reason to be in the room. I filed this away. I filed it in the place where I put things I was not yet ready to hold. She monitored details about my work that were not announced. She noticed things about my voice before I noticed them myself, had told Penn to reschedule a session 3 days before I identified the strain building in my lower register, had adjusted my project assignment once, in a way that gave me exactly the rest I had not yet asked for. She gave direction to me, specifically, in the second person. I had not known this was different from how she directed everyone else until a journalist named Kress pointed it out 2 weeks after the corridor. What I had understood, and had been careful not to examine too closely, was that her attention to me was particular, not warmer, not more personal in any way I could have named, in a professional context, just more specific. As though I were a problem she was monitoring with greater care than the others. As though she had already decided how I worked and was watching to see if she was right. I had been telling myself this was professional investment. It is possible I had been telling myself this, because the alternative had implications I was not ready for. She was already at her desk in the control room when I arrived at 8:15 the next morning. Coffee in a ceramic mug she had made from her own press. Maret calibrated her espresso herself, which was characteristic. Session notes open to a fresh page. She looked up when I came in. "Read my face in approximately 2 seconds," she said. "Good morning," I said. "I stayed late last night." She set the mug down. I said, "I went back to the corridor after 7 to finish the retake." She said nothing. I said, "Your private studio." The door at the far end of the hall. It was open. The control room ventilation made its low sound. The monitor speakers were dark. She looked at me for a measured moment, and her face gave me nothing and everything, which was her particular gift. I said, "I heard it. The recording I made 4 years ago, the personal piece. The one I sent as a general submission to studios when I was still doing commercial work at Redline." She said, "Yes." I said, "I didn't know you had received it. I didn't know it was here." She picked up her coffee, set it down again. She said, "I received it in the 3rd year of the studio. You were still working commercial work. The submission was different from what I was receiving at that time. I kept it." I said, "That is not a full explanation." "I know," she said. I said, "Why did you keep it?" She considered the answer with the care she brought to everything, not to delay it, but to find the precise formulation. She said, "Because it was the clearest example I had heard, in 3 years of receiving submissions, of a voice that was completely without management." I said, "I'm a voice artist. Management is the entire discipline." She said, "I know." Which is what made the recording notable. You were not performing. You were present with what you were reading. The distinction between those two things is rarely available in professional work. In that recording, it was complete and consistent across the whole piece. I said, "You study it." She said, "I listen to it." There was a difference between those two things which we both understood. I said, "How often?" She looked at her notebook. She said, "Regularly." I said, "That is not a specific answer." She said, "No, it is not." I said, "Maret." She said, "Most evenings?" The room became very aware of its own dimensions. I was aware of the distance between the table where I was standing and the desk where she sat, which was approximately 6 feet, and which I had never registered as a number before. I said, "Most evenings." "For how long?" She said, "Since the 2nd month you were working here. I recognized your voice the first time you were in the recording booth." I said nothing because you had applied through different channels, and the original recording was personal material, and using it as reference would have required me to account for reasons I had not yet found the right language for. I said, "And you still haven't." She held my gaze. She said, "I would prefer not to have the full account, while I am still your employer." I said, "When, then?" She said, "I don't know. Not today." I picked up my session notes from the table. At the door I stopped. I said, "Maret." She looked up. I said, "The voice on that recording, that is still my voice. Whatever you have been hearing in it for 2 years, that is still me." She looked at me for 1 beat longer than the exchange required. She said, "Yes, I know." I left. What happened over the following 2 weeks was a recalibration so careful I almost missed it. Maret had always been precise in the studio. After the corridor, she became precise with additional structure. Direction she had previously given in person now arrived through notes left at my workstation before sessions. Feedback she had historically delivered face-to-face during playback came through the headphone talkback system instead. The physical distance between us during sessions, always professionally maintained, became something slightly more deliberate, not cold, just structured in a way that had not been necessary before. I noticed all of it. Penn Adderley noticed me noticing. Penn was Thread and Tone's senior producer and had been at the studio for 8 years, longer than anyone except Maret. She was 42, warm in the way of someone who had survived enough of this industry to understand that warmth was the most durable professional quality she possessed. She kept the studio functional on the days when Maret was building something too large to also manage its administration, And she had the observational intelligence of someone who had spent 8 years watching complicated people work in close quarters and had developed the discipline to mostly keep what she saw to herself. She caught me watching Marette through the control room glass during a mixing session I had no particular reason to be watching. "Lark," she said, without turning from her monitor. I looked away from the glass. She said, "You are good at your work, and you are not typically the kind of person who forgets which studio she is supposed to be in." I said, "I'm reviewing notes." She said, "Your notes are in Studio 3. I had not moved. Pen turned from her monitor. She had a direct, unhurried face, the face of someone who had weathered enough difficult conversations to understand that the difficult ones were usually the ones that needed to happen. She said, "Whatever it is, go home, get some rest." I said, "I don't need rest." She said, "I know. Everyone who needs it says that." She turned back to her monitor. I went home. Dale was at the kitchen counter when I got in, working at her laptop with a glass of wine beside her. She was an architect, and she had the architect's relationship with the spaces she moved through, attentive to them, always slightly evaluating, rarely entirely still inside a room. She looked up when I came in and smiled the easy, warm, uncomplicated smile of someone who is genuinely glad to see a familiar thing. We had been married for 3 years, together for 5. In the early years there had been urgency between us, the kind that comes from two people who have found something unexpected in each other and are still discovering its dimensions. That urgency had settled, the way urgency does, into comfort and routine and the specific shorthand of two people who know each other's patterns well. The difficulty with knowing someone's patterns well is that patterns and presence are not the same thing. She said, "Late night?" I said, "Mix session ran long." She went back to her screen. I set my bag down and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her and thought about my voice, 4 years ago, reading words I had written in the first year of our marriage. I thought about the recording and what it meant that Marette had kept it, that she knew those words by heart. I thought, Dale had never heard that recording. She had been traveling when I made it. She had never asked to hear it. The thought was not an accusation. I was not looking to assign it anywhere. It was simply a fact I was sitting with for the first time, sitting with it and feeling its weight, which was not nothing. I sat down at the table. I said, "Do you remember the audio piece I made right after we got married? The personal monologue I was using for auditions?" She thought for a moment. "The one with the window? You were working on it late that week." "Yes," I said. She said, "I don't think I ever actually listened to it. You were working late and I had the early call. Did it lead anywhere?" I said, "I sent it to a lot of studios. I'm not sure." She nodded and turned back to her screen. I sat at the table and thought about the most useful place that recording had gone, which was apparently a private studio on West 29th Street where someone I worked with had been listening to it most evenings for 2 years. Cress Aldrin arrived at Thread and Tone the following Monday on assignment for a major culture publication. She was writing a long feature on independent audio production, specifically, the small number of studios that had maintained artistic standards under increasing commercial pressure. Meridian was the lead subject, but Thread and Tone had been highlighted as the defining example of the form. Marette had agreed to the feature with what Penn described to me as unprecedented compliance. Penn noted that Marette had declined every press inquiry for the previous 4 years and seemed unconcerned about explaining why she was accepting this one now. The timing, Penn said, was interesting. I had my own opinion about the timing. Cress was 31, easy-mannered, with the particular social patience of someone who had spent years asking strangers to explain themselves and had become good at making the explanation feel like the stranger's idea. She sat in the control room for 2 days, observing sessions, asking precise questions, taking notes in a narrow notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. She had the journalist's gift of becoming easy to forget. On the second day, she observed my narration block for the documentary project, currently in production, a long-form audio series about 3 generations of women in a Sicilian hill town, which I had been working on for 7 weeks, and which required me to hold a single voice across 3 distinct emotional registers without losing the coherence of one continuous narrator. After the session, in the corridor, she stopped me. She said, "Off the record. I've watched Marette direct 3 different narrators across 2 days. I want to ask you something specifically about how she directs you. I said, go ahead. She said, every direction she gives the other artists is in the third person. The character feels. The character pauses. The character reaches for the door. With you, the direction is always in the second person. You feel, you pause, you reach. You're placed inside the narration, not adjacent to it. It's consistent across every session I observed today, regardless of the material. I said, the material in this project is more intimate. She adjusts her approach to what the piece requires. Cress tilted her head. The patient, non-committal head tilt of a journalist who has already formed an assessment and is curious what you will say next. She said, I noted the same directorial choices in a session with another narrator this morning on a piece with equally intimate material, the third person held. With you, it doesn't. The second person stays regardless of what you're working on. I said nothing. She said, I'm not asking you to confirm anything. I'm telling you what I observed from the outside. She went back to the control room. I stood in the corridor for a moment. I thought about the second person. About being placed inside the narration, rather than adjacent to it. About what it means to be addressed directly in a space where professional address is always managed. I had noticed it. I had been noticing it for 2 years, and filing it as technique. I understood, standing in the corridor with the door to the control room 20 feet away, that it was not technique. The conversation I had been building toward without acknowledging the building arrived on a Thursday in November. Marette asked me to stay for a direction session after the rest of the studio had cleared. This was not unusual during a long production. She walked narrators through the arc of a project periodically, refining the approach against the accumulated recorded work. I had had these sessions before. I had never been entirely able to account for the texture of them, which was different from any other professional meeting I had, as though the air in the room was operating at a slightly different pressure. The control room was quiet, the monitors warm. She had the week's waveforms up on the main screen, the visual record of my voice in peaks and valleys, and a production sheet covered in her small, precise handwriting. She played a take from 2 days before. I heard myself working through the final passage of the second episode, a scene about a woman standing in her mother's kitchen after a long absence, trying to locate the specific quality of a feeling that had no clean translation into any language she had been given. I had found it in take 3. She said, the difference between take 1 and take 3. What changed? I thought about the booth. About the small internal adjustment I had made before the third take, the decision to stop arranging the feeling and simply let it land where it was. I said, I stopped managing the approach. I stopped arranging the feeling from the outside and let it be present. She nodded. That is right. She was quiet for a moment. She said, the recording I have from 4 years ago has that quality throughout the entire piece, not in specific passages, not on particular takes. Throughout, consistently, as the condition of the whole recording. I said, you have been trying to direct me back to that condition. Yes, she said, without using the recording as direct reference, without having to explain why I kept it. I said, has it worked? She looked at the waveforms on the screen. She said, some of the time, increasingly, as this production has progressed, but not consistently, because what is in the recording is not a technique. Techniques can be directed from the outside. This is a condition. I said, what condition? She was quiet long enough that I understood she was selecting the honest answer over the professional one. She said, the condition of being fully present with something you cannot afford to lie about. I looked at the screen, my voice in visual form, the peaks and the valleys of it. I said, you believe I have that condition. She said, I know you do. I heard it 4 years ago. I have been hearing it in the work here, with increasing consistency, across the past months. I said, you play the recording most evenings. She said, yes. I said, for 2 years. She said, yes. I said, that is the most intimate thing anyone has done with me in a very long time. The words arrived before I calculated them. They were true, which was why they arrived without preparation. She absorbed them. She was very good at absorbing accurate things without trying to redirect them. I said, "I'm married." "I know," she said. I said, "And you are my employer." She said, "I know that too." I said, "And this is the most complicated possible professional situation." She said, "Yes, it is." I said, "And you play my voice anyway." The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. She did not need to confirm what was already in the room. I said, "Why now? Why say any of this now, after 2 years of not saying it?" She said, "Because you were in the corridor, and I was not willing to give you the version of the story that left out the real part." I held her gaze for a long moment. I said, "I need time. Whatever this is, I need time. I need you to not change anything in how you direct my work. I need the work to stay what it is." She said, "The work is the work. That does not change." I picked up my things. At the door I stopped. I said, "Tell me the words. On the recording. The specific ones you keep coming back to." She looked at me. Then she told me. 3 lines from a piece I had written at 2 in the morning 4 years ago. In the first year of a marriage I was still deciding how to inhabit. She quoted them precisely. She knew them with the specificity of someone who had lived with them for a long time and no longer needed to think about the order. I went home with those 3 lines sitting inside me. Diel was asleep when I got in. I stood in the bedroom doorway and looked at her sleeping face, the face I had chosen, and that had been, in most measurable ways, a good choice, a true choice, a choice made with full knowledge of who she was, and I thought about 3 lines from a piece I had written in the first year of our marriage that my wife had never heard and my employer knew by heart. I went to the kitchen. I sat at the table in the dark and did not turn on the light. I thought about the condition, about being fully present with something you cannot afford to lie about who I had been when I made that recording and who I had been carefully performing in the years since, about the specific quality of being heard by someone who had been listening for longer than you knew. I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The session the following morning was a narration block for the Sicilian Project, the 4th episode, a scene set in a market in Palermo before the rest of the city was awake, a woman buying bread she would carry back to a house where nothing was the way it used to be. I had been looking forward to this passage. The material felt close to something I understood. I could not find it. I ran the passage 6 times. The engineer was patient. The takes were technically clean. They were not wrong in any way I could identify by listening to the playback, but they were missing the specific quality that had been arriving with increasing frequency in recent months, the quality that Moret had been calling a condition. I understood, sitting in the booth with my headphones around my neck between the 5th and 6th takes, that I could not separate the condition from what I now knew, that the voice she had been listening to for 2 years kept in a private file, played most evenings, was the voice I had when I was not performing. And I had spent the previous 24 hours performing equanimity for Diel, performing professionalism in the morning's corridor, performing my own composure for an audience of no one in a kitchen with the lights off. The 6th take was closer, still not right. Pen came into the booth after the session. She said, "The 4th episode needs another pass." I said, "I know." She said, "Take the afternoon, come back to it fresh." I went home. I sat in the apartment that felt, after Dale's architectural eye, and 5 years of living inside someone else's vision of space, temporarily and correctly like my own. I sat in it for several hours. I did not work on the narration. I thought about the condition, and about what it required, and about who I had been in that kitchen in October 4 years ago, reading words to no audience, discovering something about the quality of my own honesty. By morning, the 4th episode was accessible again. The first take of it was the one we kept. The morning brought Cress back for her final observation day at Thread and Tone. Before she left, she came to find me in the edit suite. She said, "I wanted to tell you before I filed the piece. The 3rd take from the Sicilian kitchen scene. I was in the control room when it played back on Thursday. I've been covering audio production for 6 years. I stopped writing my notes when that take came on." I said, "It was a good take." She said, "It was the most honest thing I've heard in a recording session in 6 years. And I want to say whatever is making that possible, whatever is happening in that room, It is in the work. It is audible from the outside. She said it with the care of someone who had seen something and was reporting it plainly. She was not pushing anything open. She said goodbye. She left. I went to find Pen. Pen was in the edit suite reviewing a completed mix. I sat down across from her. She looked up, then looked at my face for a moment, with the attentive patience of a woman who had been paying attention for a long time. She said, "You've been coming in early for a week, staying late." I said, "The Sicilian project has a delivery window." She said, "Lark." I said nothing. She said, "In 8 years I have watched people work in this building in every possible configuration of professional and personal. I know what the good work looks like when it is being made. I also know what it costs." I said, "I'm fine." She said, "I know you are fine. Fine is not the question. The question is whether you know what you're standing in the middle of." I said, "Not entirely. Not yet." She said, "Good. It's better to not know than to know wrong." I said, "What does that mean?" She said, "It means there are 2 versions of how people navigate something they're inside. The first version is to name it before they understand it, and then spend their energy defending the name. The second version is to wait until the understanding arrives and name it once, correctly." I said, "You're describing a production approach." She said, "I'm describing everything. The work and the not work. The same principle runs through both." I said, "And which version does Maret use?" Pen looked at me. It was a long, unhurried look. The look of someone with 8 years of observational evidence, deciding what portion of it was professionally appropriate to share. She said, "Maret has been naming something wrong for 2 years because she named it before she was ready to understand what it was. She called it a directorial resource. She called it a production instinct. She called it a professional challenge. She called it everything except what it was, and the not naming made it larger rather than smaller, which is what happens when you use the wrong container." I said, "And now?" Pen said, "Now she knows what it is, and she is doing the most honest thing she has ever done about it, in the only form she knows how to do honesty, which is structurally and at professional cost. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, more than most people manage." I said, "How long have you known?" Pen said, "A year. Closer to 14 months. I said, "And you didn't say anything?" She said, "It was not mine to say. It was hers to say, and it was yours. I was waiting for one of you to find the way in." I said, "I was waiting for the same thing." Pen said, "I know. You were both very patient. And," she added, with the particular flatness she reserved for the truest observations, "very foolish." She nodded once, in the way of someone who had expected that answer and had decided to respect it. She said, "The third take from Thursday, the kitchen scene. I listened to it 3 times. I said, "And?" She said, "Whatever you are standing in the middle of, do not move away from it too quickly. The work needs it." She turned back to her mix. I sat for a moment. I said, "That is the most complicated piece of advice I have ever received." She said, "I know. The necessary ones usually are." I came back to the building at 9 on a Tuesday in November. I had left my production notes and needed them for the morning session. The corridor was dark. The building should have been empty. Light came from under the control room door. I pushed it open. Maret was at the desk. She was not working. The main monitors were running at low level, and what they were running was the Sicilian project. My voice, from the previous Thursday's session, moving through the kitchen scene passage. She heard me come in. She let the passage finish before she turned. When she turned, she had the quality she only had in the private versions of the studio after hours. The building quiet, no session running. The composure was real. It was always real. What was also real was the thing operating underneath it, which she had been managing for 2 years and which I had recently stopped pretending I could not see. She said, "You came back." I said, "I left my notes." She reached for the fader and brought the level down. Not off, just lower. My voice dropped in the room but did not disappear. I crossed to the desk. I sat in the second chair, beside her, not across from her. The waveform of my voice was still on the monitor, my voice at almost 0, still moving through the speakers. She did not move her chair. I said, "I've been thinking about what you said. About the condition." She looked at the screen. I said, "I think you have it too. I just have not heard your recording." A long silence. The studio hummed. She said, "What do you mean?" I said, "The reason your direction works. The reason it produces what it produces, you are not managing it from the outside. You are inside it. Whatever you have been carrying in this building for 2 years, you have been fully present with it, and it shows in every decision you make." She looked at the monitor. Then at me. I said, "I have not been happy in my marriage. I want you to know that separately from everything else. It has been true for a long time. It was true before the corridor. It was true before I started here." Her shoulders were very still. I said, "I am not asking anything from you. I am telling you the honest version because you have been listening to the honest version of me for 2 years and you deserve the same." She said, "Lark." I said, "I need you to know that I see what this is. What you have been carrying." She looked at the monitor. Then at me. In the low, warm light of the control room, she looked precisely like herself, which was the most unguarded she ever looked, not because the composure was gone, but because it was doing less work than usual. The precision was real. The control was real. What was also real was the thing they were containing, which had been real for longer than she had told me, and which she had decided to stop hiding from completely. She said, "It has been a long time to carry it." I held her gaze. Then she reached out. She put her hand over mine where it rested at the edge of the desk. Not hard, not urgent, just there, warm and present and specific. The weight of something that had been withheld for a long time and was finally, in this room at this hour, not. Neither of us moved. We sat that way for a long time in the low, warm light of the control room with my voice moving at almost nothing through the monitors, with the building humming its familiar sound around us and the city pressing in from the window, and neither of us knowing what came next or asking the room to tell us. Then she said, very quietly, "You should go." I said, "I know." We did not move for one more moment. Then she lifted her hand. She looked at me directly, completely, with everything she had been managing for 2 years visible at the surface for one long second. And then she composed it. All of it. Back inside the control. She said, "Good night." I said, "Good night." I left. In the elevator, I pressed my palm flat against the cool wall and looked at the floor numbers and thought about what it felt like to be heard by someone who had been listening before they knew you were coming. I thought, this is the most honest thing that has happened to me in 3 years. I thought, I do not know what comes next. I thought, I know what I am no longer willing to do without. The elevator opened. The night was outside. I walked into it. The apartment was dark when I got home. Dial had not waited up, which was not unusual. She worked early, and had learned years ago that waiting for me when a session ran long was a form of patience that cost her the next day. I stood in the kitchen in my coat for a long time without turning on the light or taking anything off. I thought about the control room, the low monitors, my voice at almost nothing through the speakers, her hand. I thought about the word that kept returning to me in the elevator on the way down. She had said, "It has been a long time to carry it," and I understood, standing in my dark kitchen at 9:30 on a Tuesday in November, that what she had been carrying was something she had never once put on the table between us and asked me to see. She had taken it alone into every session, every note, every decision about my work and my schedule, and the particular pace at which she moved me toward more demanding material. She had carried it without putting it down, without asking for anything in return. That was, I decided, standing in the dark, the specific form of her love for 2 years. Not the recording, the carrying. I went to bed. I lay in the dark beside Dale, who was breathing in the slow and regular way of someone who has reached sleep easily, and I looked at the ceiling and thought about the condition, about the quality of being fully present with something you cannot afford to lie about. I had not been lying about my marriage. The word that fit, I decided, was managing, the way you manage a room with imperfect acoustics. You work around the problem, you position your equipment to minimize the effect. You call it functional and you do good work inside it, and you do not, at any point, name the original flaw out loud or examine what it would mean to address it properly. I had been managing my marriage for a long time. In the morning, Dale was already at the kitchen counter with her coffee and her tablet, reviewing the structural drawings for a project that had been occupying her for the past month. She had the architect's relationship with her work total, absorptive, beautiful in a way that was difficult to interrupt even when the interruption was necessary. She looked up when I came in. She looked at my face for a moment, with the careful attention she had always brought to me. The specific attention of someone who loved something they understood was fragile without quite knowing why. I said, "Dale." She looked up from the tablet. I said, "I think we need to have a conversation this week, when you have time and space for it." She looked at me for a long moment, then she said, "Okay," in the quiet voice of someone who has been half expecting a sentence without knowing its shape. I said, "Not this morning." "When you're ready." She said, "Okay," again, and went back to her tablet. And I understood, from the particular quality of the silence that followed, that she was not surprised. That she had, in her own way, been waiting for a version of this for a while. I went to Thread and Tone. Maurette was in the control room when I arrived. Not at her desk, standing at the window that overlooked the production floor below, her coffee in both hands, her back to the room. She heard me come in, and she did not turn around immediately. She gave me the room to sit down. To be in the space. She had always done that, I realized, given me the room to arrive before she addressed me. I had thought it was professional courtesy. I understood now it was something more specific. She said, still facing the window. "I have been thinking about what you said last night." I said, "Which part?" She said, "The part about intimacy. About what I have been doing with the recording." I waited. She turned around. In the morning light, with the full precision of her composure restored, she was entirely herself and also, in a way I had not been able to see before November, entirely visible. The composure was not hiding anything anymore. It was just hers. She said, "I have been using something that belonged to you, the private version of you. The version you made for yourself, and not for professional assessment, as a container for something I did not have the courage to name." For 2 years, while occupying the position I occupy, and I want to say out loud, in the morning, and not at 9 o'clock at night with the monitors doing my emotional work for me, that I understand what that means. I said, "Tell me." She said, "It means that the feeling, however real it is, does not entitle me to use what you made. You sent it to a production company for a professional purpose. I kept it for a personal one. Those are different things and the difference matters." I said, "I know," she said, "and it means I have been directing you for 2 years inside conditions that were more complicated than they should have been, for my own reasons. The work was real, your development was real. But the conditions were not clean, and you deserved clean conditions." I said, "And now?" She said, "I am going to tell Vera." I said, "Your managing partner?" "Yes," she said, "I should have disclosed a conflict of interest some time ago. I have been managing it privately, which has not been fair to the organization or to you." I said, "What will you tell her?" She said, "That I have developed a personal investment in one of the studio's primary artists that has been affecting my directorial decisions for approximately 2 years, that it should have been disclosed earlier, that I am disclosing it now and willing to accept whatever restructuring Vera determines is appropriate." I said, "They may restructure you out of my projects entirely." She said, "They may. That would be correct." I looked at her. I said, "Maurette, do it because it is right, not because you think it produces a particular outcome." She looked at me steadily. She said, "I know the difference." I believed her. That was the fundamental thing about Maurette. Her relationship with correct accounting was too structural, too constitutive of who she was, to be deployed strategically. She was not doing this to move towards something. She was doing it because it was correct, and she could not live indefinitely in the gap between what she knew was correct and what she was doing. She met with Vera Ashdale that afternoon. Vera had run the business side of Thread and Tone for 11 years alongside Maurette, and she had the particular efficiency of someone who had managed enough human complexity to be past surprise. Penn told me about the meeting afterward in the edit suite, sitting across from me at the board, looking at something on the monitor and not looking at me. She said, "There's going to be a restructuring of your production oversight. For the Sicilian delivery and the new work going forward, I'll be taking primary production lead. Maret will remain as creative director but will not be in direct session work with you for the foreseeable period." I said, "Is she all right?" Penn said, "She will be." I said, "What did Vera?" Penn said, "Vera handled it the way Vera handles most things. With the efficiency of someone who has already considered all the relevant scenarios and simply needed the formal disclosure to confirm what she had been watching develop for some months." I said, "Penn, that's not a complete answer." She said, "No, but it's the accurate one. The restructuring was clean and not punitive." Penn took over direct production on the Sicilian project. Maret's notes continued to inform the sessions. The precision of them was unchanged. The judgment was unchanged, but they arrived through Penn rather than directly, which meant the appropriate professional distance was now built into the structure. Distance that should have been there from the beginning. The sessions were good. The work continued to be the work. I went into the booth and I did what I had always done, which was to stop managing the feeling and let it land where it was. And the recordings from that period were among the strongest of the production. Penn said once, reviewing a take from mid-December, that she thought it was the best sustained narration she had produced in 8 years at Thread and Tone. I told her what Maret had told me, which was that the condition the work required was not a technique. Penn said, "I know that. I've been producing voice work for 16 years. The question is where the condition comes from." I said, "I think it comes from understanding what you want to be honest about." Penn said, "Yes, that's exactly right." She went back to the board. I went home and sat in my apartment and thought about what I had said and who I had said it to and who I had not said it to yet and what that meant about what I still needed to do. The conversation with Dale happened on a Thursday at the kitchen table. She made tea, which was what she did when she understood a conversation required some version of ceremony. She sat across from me with her hands around the mug and she looked at me with the complete, careful attention she had always brought to me, which was a form of love I wanted to honor properly. I said, "I don't think I have been fully here, in this marriage, for a long time." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I know." I said, "Not because of anything you've done or not done. You have been who you said you were, and you have been here. I know that. I'm saying I have not been fully here in return, and that the absence has been mine to account for, not something that happened to me." She looked at her tea. She said, "Where have you been?" I said, "I think I have been managing us. The way I manage work, I'm not fully inside, performing the presence without having the presence." She said, "That's honest." I said, "I am trying to be." She said, "Is there someone—" I thought about how to answer this in a way that was true without being more than what was true. I said, "There is a recognition. I have understood something I was not feeling here, feeling somewhere else. I haven't acted on it. I don't know yet what it means in practical terms. But it told me something honest about what is and is not in this marriage, and I owe you that honesty, rather than continuing to manage around it." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I think I've been doing the same thing." I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Managing. Performing the shape of this rather than living inside it. I have been correct about us for a long time, and it has felt like enough sometimes and sometimes it hasn't, and I have not said so." I said, "Why didn't you?" She said, "Because I loved you when we started, and the correct version of us was also true, and I could not work out which thing mattered more, the feeling or the truth." I said, "I think they're supposed to be the same thing." She said, "I think so too." We sat at the table for a long time after that, not crying, not arguing, two people who had loved each other correctly and grown into a careful performance of it, sitting in the specific clearing that honesty makes when you finally let it enter a room. The separation was handled with care over the following weeks. Practical, kind, unhurried. We sorted what needed sorting and we were honest with each other throughout, and I think we honored what had been real by not pretending it had been more or less than it was. I moved into a sublet in the same neighborhood in early December. I told Dale I was sorry for the time it had taken me to be honest. She told me the same. We meant it. We still do. I continued going to Thread and Tone every morning. The Sicilian Project delivered in December. 3 months of work, 12 episodes, the most sustained narrative voice work of my professional life. The publication reviews came in through January and February, and they were, collectively, the best reception Thread and Tone had produced for a long-form project. One review in a major culture publication said the narration had the quality of something recorded in a room where the narrator was completely alone with the truth of the material. I read it on a Tuesday morning, in my sublet apartment, with coffee going cold on the windowsill, and thought about a control room in November, and a hand over a hand, and a voice at almost zero on the monitors. I sent the review to Marette's professional email with no comment. She replied with 2 words. Thank you. We had not been alone in the same room since November. Penn updated me on the studio's practical matters the way she always had, efficiently and without drama. Marette was present in the building, running the company, operating as creative director across all active projects. She had chosen to take a formal advisory role in my project work for the new year rather than the direct production role she had previously held, a voluntary step that Vera had not required but had accepted. She had also, Penn mentioned once in passing, been reviewing the recordings from the Sicilian sessions every morning before anyone else arrived. I said, Penn, you don't have to tell me that. Penn said, I know. I told you anyway. I thought about it for a long time. It was March when Marette emailed me, not through the studio system, my personal address, which she had had since the beginning and had never used. The email was 4 sentences. It said that if I was open to it, she would like to have a conversation outside the building. Not about the work. She hoped I was well. Let me know. I sat with the email for 3 days. I read it again each morning. I thought about what she was asking, and what I was afraid of, and whether the fear was a signal or a form of management. I thought about the recording and the condition, and the specific quality of being heard by someone who had been listening before you knew they were there. On the 3rd day, I wrote back. Saturday. The coffee place on Commerce, 11. She was there when I arrived, dark jeans and a gray jacket, her hair down, a coffee already on the table, no notebook, no studio lanyard, nothing professional around her at all. She looked like a person sitting in a coffee shop on a Saturday morning, and the specific ordinariness of it, after 2 years of knowing her as the most composed presence in a controlled environment, produced in me the particular quality of recognition that comes when you understand you were waiting for this version of someone, without knowing what you were waiting for. She said, Thank you for coming. I said, Thank you for asking in a way that gave me the option not to. She said, I wanted you to have the option. I was not certain you would want to. I said, I wasn't certain either, until the 3rd morning. She looked at me. Something in her face shifted slightly. She said, I want to say something specific, not the professional account, the one underneath it. I said, Go ahead. She said, I owe you an apology for the recording. Not for having it as you said, you sent it, but for what I did with it. I used something intimate that you made in a private moment of your life as a container for feelings I did not have the honesty to name. I let it be a substitute for saying a true thing. I told myself it was a professional resource, and I understood, increasingly and specifically, that it was not, and I continued anyway. That was not fair to you, I said. I know, she said, and I owe you an apology for the conditions of the past 2 years. The way I structured your work around what I was experiencing rather than what you professionally required. I told myself those were identical. They were not always identical. I said, The work was the best I've ever done. She said, I know. I said, I am not taking that back because the conditions were complicated. The work is real. What happened in that booth is real. I am saying, I know the difference between what was clean about it and what wasn't. She absorbed that. She said, I'm glad the work is something you can keep. I said, I ended my marriage. She did not move toward this. She let it land in the room at its own weight. She said, I know. Penn mentioned something. I am sorry. I said, Don't be. It was right. It was the right thing for a long time. You were not the cause of it, you were the occasion for me naming what was already true. She said, there's a difference. I said, yes. I need you to understand it. She said, I do. I said, I'm not ready to begin anything. I know what I want eventually. I know that, clearly. But I've just left a 3-year marriage and I need to actually sit inside that rather than moving directly toward the next thing because the next thing is present and available and seems like warmth. She said, of course. I said, I need to know that you can give me time without managing the situation, without building a structure around the waiting that is really about controlling the outcome. She was quiet for a moment. She said, that is a very precise description of what I have historically done. I said, I know. She said, I can give you the time, without structures, without a production plan for the outcome. I said, say it without the studio language. The corner of her mouth moved, barely. She said, I will wait, as long as you need. Without trying to make the waiting useful, I said, better. We stayed for 2 hours. We talked about the architectural series Thread and Tone was building toward, which Penn had described to me as the most ambitious project the studio had attempted in its history. We talked about a documentary Maurette had seen over the winter whose sound design she had been turning over in her mind for weeks because she could not identify whether it was serving the material or quietly working against it. We talked about a piece of recorded music she had been living with, not mine. A Norwegian composer whose use of silence in the third movement she found structurally unresolved in a way that was either a flaw or a choice, and she had not yet determined which. It was the most ordinary conversation I had ever had with her. It was also, underneath its ordinariness, the most intimate. When we left, she held the door. On the pavement outside, she put her hands in her jacket pockets and looked at me with the March morning behind her and everything that had happened in the previous months present in her face, without the management. She said, same time next week, if you want. I said, yes. She said, good. I walked away first. At the corner, I looked back. She was still on the pavement, watching me go, and the March light was doing something useful to her face, not changing it, but illuminating what had always been in it, and which she had stopped spending all of her energy concealing. The Saturdays continued through April and into May. Some weeks we met at the coffee shop, some weeks we walked. The conversations were not always about work, which was itself something new. I had known her for 2 years and our language had always been the language of the studio. Finding a different language for each other was slower and more interesting than I had expected. She talked about the sound art years with a particular care, the way people talk about periods of their lives they value and have not examined in a long time. I asked questions and she answered them directly, which was one of her fundamental qualities, this willingness to answer a direct question without redirecting it. I told her about the year of the recording, not just the night I made it, the whole year. The feeling of having been correct about all the major decisions of my life and sitting in an apartment at 2 a.m, unsure whether correctness was the right thing to have been optimizing for. She said, what did you want instead? I said, I didn't know yet. I just knew what the gap between what I had and what I needed felt like. I put it into the recording because I didn't have anywhere else to put it. She said, and then, you sent it to production companies. I said, I thought I was looking for work. She said, you were looking for something that would hear it. I said, she said, I heard it. I said, I know. She said, I'm sorry it took 2 years to tell you. I said, you told me when you could. She said, I told you when I was forced to. That's different. I said, yes. But here we are anyway. She looked at me. She said, here we are. There was a Saturday in May when she told me about the first time she had listened to the recording all the way through and understood she had a problem. She said, it was the 2nd month you were here. You had done a late session and I stayed after to review the takes. I had the original submission file open for reference. I had been using it as a private benchmark, comparing the quality of your current recorded work to the quality of what I had first heard, tracking how close the sessions were getting to the condition in the original. I said, you had a system. She said, I had a rationalization. I ran it through, all 9 minutes of it. When it ended, I sat in the control room in the dark for a long time. I said, "What happened?" She said, "I understood that what I was doing with the recording and what I was doing in the sessions were not separate things. That the listening was not a production resource. It was personal. I had been telling myself for 8 months that there was a meaningful difference between those two things, and I sat in the dark control room and understood there was no difference at all." I said, "What did you do?" She said, "I opened a new project file and started writing notes for the following week's session and told myself it was manageable. I believed that for another 14 months. The coffee shop was quiet around us. A Saturday morning quiet, easy and unhurried. She was looking at her hands on the table, and I had learned enough of her by May to know that when she looked at her hands, she was finding her way to the honest version of what she was about to say. I said, "When did you stop believing it?" She thought for a moment. She said, "The night you laughed in the parking lot after the annual project review dinner, about 6 months before November. Penn said something I couldn't hear, and you laughed the real version, the unguarded one, and I was standing at the building door and I thought, I am not managing this. I have been describing this to myself as manageable for over a year, and I am standing here in a parking lot understanding that I am not managing this even slightly." I said, "You should have said something then." She said, "I know." I said, "Why didn't you?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Because naming it would have required me to be honest about what it meant for both of us, and I was not ready to do that honestly. I was only ready to do it correctly. And correct without honest is just structure." I said, "And the corridor?" She said, "The corridor took the choice away from me, which was what I needed." It was a Saturday in June, when everything became what it had been building toward. We were at the coffee shop and then we were not at the coffee shop, we were walking, because the morning had turned into something too good to sit still inside. The city in June, doing what the city does in June, which is to be improbably generous with the light. We had been talking about a piece of music she had been working through for a week in her private studio, trying to identify what the composer was doing with a specific rest in the fourth movement that functioned differently from all the other rests in the score. She was explaining the mechanics of it with the focused attention she brought to everything she found genuinely interesting, her hands and the gesture she used when language was almost but not quite sufficient to the thing she was describing. I stopped walking. She stopped. I said, "I'm ready." She looked at me. She did not ask what I meant. She was Marat sane, and she never required clarification when the clarification was already fully present. She said, "Are you sure?" I said, "I have been sure for some time. I was waiting until I was certain the certainty was not just the warmth of something nearby. I'm certain it's not." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I want to say something first." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "I have been in love with you for 2 years. I managed it in ways that were not fair to you, and I am specifically sorry for the specific forms of that. I am not sorry for the feeling. I attempted, at certain points, to be sorry for the feeling, and I could not get there." I said, "Good." She said, "I want this to be a choice you're making because you want it. Not because of momentum or proximity, or the fact that we have been circling each other for 2 years, and the gravity of it is difficult to resist." I said, "I want it. The momentum is also there. Both things are true, and I'm not interested in disqualifying either of them." She looked at me for one long moment in the June morning. Everything she had been managing, visible at the surface, and nothing of it requiring management anymore. I reached up and touched her jaw. Just her jaw, warm skin, the specific weight of her face in my hand for the first time. She stilled the way she stilled in the studio, when a take landed exactly right, not absence, completeness. I kissed her. It was not desperate. It was not the relief of something finally permitted. It was patient in the specific way that things are patient when they have been earned, by everything that came before, 2 years of restraint, and 3 months of Saturday mornings, and 1 evening in November, in a control room, with a hand over a hand at the edge of a desk. The kiss had the weight of all of that in it, and it landed with that weight, which was not the same thing as being heavy. It was the opposite of heavy. She kissed me back. Her hand settled at my waist and stayed there. Not a claim, a presence. The difference between those two things is everything in this genre, and I understood the difference now from the inside, and it was as precise and as significant as I had believed it would be. We stood on a street in the city in June, and neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, very quietly, "I would like to have you in the studio again." I said, "On what terms?" She said, "The right terms. Penn as production lead. Me as creative director with the disclosure on record and the relationship properly acknowledged. The work separate from this. This separate from the work. Both of them real." I said, "That sounds like excellent producing." She said, "It is also something else." I said, "Yes, it is." The new configuration settled itself into the work by July. Penn ran production, Maret held creative oversight, and what had been present between us for 2 years was now known and acknowledged by everyone who needed to know, and in the structure where it needed to be. The work was better for it. Not because the complicated conditions had been producing better work, though they had been producing extraordinary work. That was true, but because the complication and the work were now operating in separate rooms, and neither one had to do the other's job. The Architectural History series began recording in August. 12 episodes, the most ambitious project Thread and Tone had attempted since I had joined the studio. I narrated the first episode on a Thursday morning, with Penn in the control room and Maret in her office, with the session feed running, and her notes arriving at the end of the day with the same precision they had always had, which was unchanged. After the session, I went to her office. The door was open. She looked up. I said, "First episode." She said, "I know." I listened to the playback. I said, "And?" She said, "The condition was consistent across the full 42 minutes." I said, "Good." She said, "Yes, good." I said, "We're going to be all right." She said, "We are going to be excellent." I said, "That's not the same thing." She almost smiled. 1 millimeter. She said, "I know. Both things can be true." In September, Thread and Tone held a gathering at a small venue in the West Village to mark the completion of the Architectural History Commission, which had been received in a way that warranted a celebration. Industry people, producers, artists, critics, engineers, people who made things for sound and understood what Thread and Tone had done across 15 years of doing it. Penn had assembled documentation on one wall of the venue. Photographs from the production phases, studio images, waveform prints, a portrait of Maret in the control room, taken from outside the glass, early in the recording process, that captured her specific quality of focus, that total absorption, in a way that made several people stop. I stood in front of it for a while. Maret came to stand beside me. I had watched her move through the room contained and professionally gracious, and clearly not enjoying this any more than she had ever enjoyed press coverage or public recognition, which was not much. She had spoken to the people she needed to speak to, and she had been correctly generous, and she had come, eventually, to stand beside me. I said, quietly, "Penn's photograph." She said, "Penn has a good eye for what a room is actually doing." We stood looking at the image. The room moved around us. A critic from the publication that had covered the Sicilian project came to speak to Maret about the new commission, and she turned toward them with the professional attention she always brought to professional obligations. She said, "This is Lark Vane, narration across both productions." She did not say anything else. She did not need to. In the way she said my name simply, with the specific weight it held for her, and without decoration, the people in the room who were paying attention understood what they were seeing. Neither of us moved away from the other for the duration of the conversation. Neither of us looked to see who was watching. It was the simplest version of the thing. Two people being visible together without flinching. The work had made it possible. The honesty had made it possible. The months of Saturdays had made it possible. All of it had been necessary, and none of it had been wasted. After, on the street, waiting for cabs going to the same address, she said, "You didn't move away." I said, "Neither did you." She said, "I haven't flinched at something true since I stopped making my own work." I said, "When are you going to start again?" She looked at me. I said, "The sound art. Your own pieces. The things you stopped making when the studio needed everything." When are you going to make something again? She said. I don't know. I said, I want to be in the room when you play the first one back. She was quiet for a moment. In the September night, with the city moving past us, she looked at me with the composure that was real and the feeling underneath it that she was no longer spending energy containing. She said, That is the most intimate thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. I said, Good. The cab came. We got in. The city went past the windows. She did not speak for a while, and I did not speak, and we sat in the particular silence of two people who have arrived somewhere after a long distance, and do not need to narrate the arrival. She said, The recording. I said, Which one? She said, Yours. The one from 4 years ago. I want you to hear it again. In the room where I've been listening to it. With me. When you're ready. I thought about a corridor in November. About a door 3 inches open. About my own voice, coming through the gap, unmanaged, reading words I had written at 2 in the morning about standing at the edge of something you cannot name. I said, I'm ready now. She turned to look at me. I said, I have been for a while. I wanted to be the one to say so. She put her hand over mine in the back of the cab. The same warmth, the same specific weight. Except this time, neither of us had anywhere to be, and neither of us was going to lift it before it was ready. And we rode through the city with it there between us, and neither of us commented on how long it had taken to get here, because we both already knew, and it was enough to be here now. When we got to the building, she unlocked the door and took the stairs. The corridor was dark in the way it was always dark after hours, the particular dark of a space that had spent the day being full of sound and was now resting. The door at the far end was unlocked. Inside, the private studio was small and exact. 1 desk, a monitor, 2 monitor speakers on their stands, a shelf with a plant on it that was doing well, a framed photograph of a gallery space Oslo, I thought, or Rotterdam with a sound installation lit in amber. The room smelled of cedar, the way the whole building did, concentrated here, in a way that was specific to a space that had been kept mostly private. She sat at the desk. I sat in the second chair. She opened the file. She said, Ready? I said, Yes. She pressed play. My voice came out of the monitors. The voice from 4 years ago. The voice that only lived when no one was listening. The voice that was fully present with something it could not afford to lie about. Present with the loneliness, and the correctness, and the question of whether correctness was the right thing to have been building a life around. I sat in the room with it for the first time. Not in a corridor. Not through 3 inches of open door. In the room, beside the woman who had been listening to it for 2 years. The recording was 9 minutes long. I know that now. I had not known it when I made it. 9 minutes of my voice reading words I had written in a single, sitting at a desk in an apartment I no longer lived in a year I had mostly closed off from regular examination. The opening passage was the one I remembered least. I had been working up to the harder material, and the opening had a quality of settling the voice, finding its level, the breath finding its rhythm that I had thought of at the time as a technical artifact, the body arriving at the microphone. I understood now it was the sound of someone arriving honestly into a private space, not performing the arrival, simply arriving. Marette was very still beside me. I was aware of her, without looking at her directly, the particular quality of her attention, which I had been on the receiving end of for 2 years, and could recognize without needing to see her face. She was listening the way she listened to things she cared most about. Completely, with her whole self oriented toward the sound. The way certain things orient toward what they need without performing the orientation. The recording was 9 minutes, and she had been sitting in this chair, in this room, with the cedar smell and the amber light and the warm monitor speakers, for most evenings across 2 years. I thought about what that looked like. What it cost. What kind of discipline it was, not the discipline of restraint, but the discipline of honoring something fully in private because the public version of it was not yet available. I had a thought, then, that I set aside until after the recording finished, that she had built her understanding of me inside this room, that the careful attention she brought to every session, every note, every adjustment to my schedule and my material, all of it had been cross-referenced against this private record, this 9-minute document of who I was before I learned to make myself professional. She had been holding both versions of me simultaneously. The working one and the honest one. Trying, with every session, to close the distance between them. I let myself hear it completely, the unevenness at the edges, the specific quality of 2 a.m. honesty, the raw material of a person who had not yet learned to manage herself back into something presentable. Near the end, there were 3 lines I had forgotten completely. They were about standing in a room where you finally understood what presence felt like after a long period of managing the shape of yourself instead of inhabiting it. They were the most honest 3 lines I had ever said into a microphone, and I had not known, when I said them, that they were a question I was asking forward in time. Now I knew the answer. When the recording ended, the studio held the specific silence that follows something completely honest. Marette said nothing. I said nothing. The monitor speakers were dark. I said, "I wrote that in the first year of my marriage." She said, "I know." I said, "I didn't know anyone was listening." She said, "I know that too." I said, "I'm glad someone was." She turned to look at me. In the amber light of the private studio, with the cedar scent around us, and the city outside doing what it always did, and the recording just finished in the air between us, she looked the way she had been building toward since November. Not managed, not composed against the thing she was feeling, simply present in the room with it, simply here. I reached over and pressed play. She let me. We sat in the private studio, with the recording running for the second time, and the monitors warm around us, and the building making its quiet building sounds, and neither of us moved away from the other, or needed to, or wanted to. We were 2 people in a room with an honest voice. The voice was mine. The listening was hers. Both of those things were, finally, in their right places. It was, as it turned out, exactly enough. It was also, in the only accounting that has ever mattered to me since that corridor in November, everything.